Security guard kicks black couple out. 15 minutes later, he's fired on the spot. Sophia and David Johnson never expected a trip to the luxury department store to end in humiliation. Accused of being out of place by a suspicious security guard, they were forced to leave in front of a crowd. But what happened next would shock everyone. A complaint, a confrontation, and a bold decision would unravel a much bigger story of bias, power, and accountability. How far would the consequences reach? And who would truly be held responsible? The late morning sun poured through the glass doors of the upscale department store, casting a golden glow across the polished marble floors. The air was filled with the soft hum of hushed conversations, the rustling of shopping bags, and the pleasant chime of the register at the perfume counter. She walked through the aisles with her husband, David, a well-built man with a warm smile and a quiet demeanor. Together, they made the kind of couple that effortlessly commanded attention. They didn't just belong in this space, they owned it. Their steps were deliberate, the light chatter between them punctuated by soft laughter as they pointed out various items that caught their eye. It was meant to be a fun, relaxed outing. They had been discussing ideas for an upcoming family event. Nothing too fancy, just a few clothes for the occasion and some accessories to go with them. However, as they moved through the aisles, a shift in atmosphere occurred that neither of them could have anticipated. Jake Thompson had only recently been hired as a security guard at the department store. A man in his late 20s with a stiff posture and a skeptical glare, Jake was still trying to adjust to the new responsibilities that came with the job. It was clear to him that the store was an exclusive place, meant for certain people, and there was an underlying pressure to maintain its reputation. His gaze caught Sophia and David as they walked past the luxury watches section. He watched them for a moment longer than necessary, a suspicion forming in the back of his mind. There was something about the way they moved, the way they looked, something that didn't sit right with him. Jake had always prided himself on being vigilant, perhaps overly so, wanting to make sure that no one took advantage of the store's leniency. Without any concrete reason, he began to follow them at a distance, his steps becoming more deliberate. Sophia noticed him trailing behind, but she didn't give it much thought at first. David, on the other hand, began to feel uncomfortable. The tension in the air shifted as Jake's presence loomed larger. The store had always prided itself on its inclusive atmosphere, and while they had their security protocol, it was rare for anything to feel out of place. But Jake had drawn an unspoken line. He moved quickly, approaching the couple as they paused in front of a high-end jacket display. "Excuse me," Jake said, his voice flat and firm, though tinged with something less obvious. "Can I help you with something?" Sophia turned toward him with a polite smile, David at her side. "No, thank you. We're just browsing." Jake's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the two of them with a look of suspicion. "Are you sure? I'm going to have to ask you to leave if you're not going to make a purchase." Sophia's smile faltered, replaced with confusion. "I'm sorry, but why would we need to leave? We're just looking." Jake's hand hovered over his radio, a subtle signal that something was off in his mind. "I'm sorry, Mom. Store policy. I'm afraid I'll have to escort you out." David, ever the calm one, stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "We've done nothing wrong. We're not causing any disturbance." Jake's eyes locked on David's, sizing him up, but there was no sign of reassurance in the guard's face. "I said leave. Now." The words echoed across the store, drawing the attention of nearby shoppers. Some paused, some glanced around. For a brief moment, the world around them seemed to slow, the warm, golden light of the store suddenly feeling harsh and unwelcoming. Sophia's heart pounded, her calm facade slipping into disbelief. She had never experienced something like this before, not in such an elegant, supposedly inclusive space. But this was happening, and the more Jake insisted, the more humiliated they became. As the crowd gathered, murmurs started to ripple through the aisles. Some customers watched with curiosity, others clearly uncomfortable, but none spoke out. It wasn't just the suspicion. It was the unspoken discrimination that dripped from Jake's words and the way his body language was so dismissive. It was a moment that would stay with them forever, a mark of indignity that wasn't easy to forget. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She exchanged a glance with David, who was now visibly upset. He had been trying to maintain his composure, but the pressure of the situation was overwhelming. How could this happen in a place like this? A place where they were spending their hard-earned money, expecting respect in return? Jake gestured toward the door, a final, cold command. I'll have to call security if you don't leave. I'm serious. David, his face flushed with frustration, placed a hand on Sophia's arm, signaling that it was time to go. They turned to leave, their hearts heavy with the sting of public humiliation, the weight of an unjust encounter hanging over them. As they walked toward the door, their footsteps echoing through the store, they both knew something needed to change. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a deeper, systemic issue, one that needed to be addressed, no matter how uncomfortable the truth was. What happened next would change everything for Sophia and David. Would they let this incident slide? Or would they take action and demand accountability? The answer lay in the next step they took, an answer that would challenge the very fabric of the store's values. The silence in the car was deafening as Sophia and David Johnson sat in their vehicle, parked outside the department store. The hum of the engine was the only sound that filled the space between them. The warm rays of the afternoon sun shone through the windshield, but inside the car, a coldness lingered. Neither of them had said a word since they had driven away from the store. Sophia gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The words, "I'm afraid I'll have to escort you out," echoed in her mind, reverberating against the raw feeling of humiliation she couldn't shake. It was more than just the incident, it was the implications of what had happened. She felt a sharp sting of anger mixed with disbelief. How had they gone from being regular customers to being treated like criminals, all because of their skin color? David, sitting beside her, ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. His jaw was clenched, but his silence spoke volumes. He had been trying to keep his cool, to avoid a scene, but the emotional weight of the situation had hit him harder than he expected. He hadn't wanted to make a fuss, but this wasn't just about him and Sophia anymore. It was about something far bigger, a pattern of behavior that had been ingrained in places like this for far too long. Are we really just going to let this slide? David finally spoke, his voice tinged with frustration. I mean, that guy just kicked us out of the store for no reason. Sophia didn't respond immediately. She stared out the window, her eyes tracing the movement of pedestrians outside. It wasn't just about being kicked out. It was the way Jake had looked at them, the way he assumed they didn't belong. It was the feeling that no matter how much they accomplished, how much they earned, they would always be seen as outsiders in spaces that were supposed to be open to everyone. "We're not letting this slide, David," Sophia said finally, her voice firm with resolve. "I'm going to do something about it." David turned to look at her. He could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that had been there ever since he met her. It was the same resolve that had carried them both through years of hard work and overcoming obstacles. He had no doubt that once Sophia made up her mind, there was no turning back. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he could guess the answer. Sophia let out a breath, her gaze never leaving the road ahead. "I'm calling Emily Roberts. She's the regional director for the store. If they're going to run a place like that, they need to be held accountable." David nodded slowly, his expression still tense. "I know you're upset, but are you sure about this? What if it just ends up being a waste of time?" Sophia turned to look at him then, her face serious. "It's not a waste of time if we make a change. If I don't speak up, nothing will ever change. Someone has to make them realize that what happened today was wrong. It was racist. We don't get to walk away from that." David sat back in his seat, still processing the intensity of Sophia's words. He understood her need to stand up for what was right, but he also knew how exhausting it could be to challenge systems of power, especially ones built on old, racist assumptions. Sophia reached for her phone, her fingers already dialing Emily Roberts' number. She didn't hesitate. She knew exactly what she needed to do. Later that day, Emily Roberts answered the phone with her usual professionalism, but there was an unexpected urgency in Sophia's voice when she introduced herself. "Hello, Emily. My name is Sophia Johnson, and I was just in your store with my husband, David. I need to speak to you about an incident that happened." There was a pause on the other end before Emily responded, her tone shifting to one of concern. "I'm so sorry to hear that something went wrong during your visit. What happened?" Sophia took a deep breath, trying to remain calm as she recounted the events. "We were shopping in your store today when we were approached by one of your security guards, Jake Thompson. He assumed we didn't belong there and asked us to leave. He was rude and dismissive, and we were humiliated in front of other shoppers." Emily's voice was full of empathy now. "I can't apologize enough for this, Sophia. This is completely unacceptable. I want to meet with you and your husband as soon as possible to address this situation. I promise you that we take this seriously." Sophia felt a slight relief at Emily's response. It wasn't just lip service. Emily sounded genuine. "Thank you, Emily. We appreciate that. We just want something to be done about this. No one should ever feel like we did today." "I agree wholeheartedly," Emily said. "Let me set up a meeting for tomorrow morning. We'll get this sorted out, I promise." As the call ended, Sophia felt a sense of determination flood her. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just the beginning. The next morning, the meeting with Emily took place in a sleek, modern office on the upper floors of the department store. Emily greeted them warmly as they entered, her face full of concern. "I'm so sorry again for what happened," Emily said, motioning for them to take a seat. "I can't imagine how that must have felt." Sophia nodded, though her expression remained serious. "It wasn't just about how it felt, Emily. It's about the bigger issue, the assumptions that were made about us, the way we were treated just because of how we look. This happens all the time in stores like this, but it's rarely addressed." David leaned forward slightly. "It's not just one bad apple. There's a deeper problem here, and if it's not dealt with, it'll keep happening." Emily nodded, clearly listening intently. "I hear you, and I'm ready to take action. We'll be investigating this thoroughly. This behavior is unacceptable, and we're committed to doing better. I'll personally handle this situation with Jake." Sophia felt a small glimmer of hope, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down just yet. "What about changes to the store's policies? What about the rest of your staff? This isn't just about one security guard. It's about the culture that allowed him to act this way." Emily took a deep breath. "You're right, and that's why I've already started drafting a plan for new initiatives. We'll be rolling out comprehensive bias training for all employees, reviewing our hiring practices, and creating an anonymous feedback system to give customers a voice when they see something wrong." Sophia and David exchanged a look. It was a start, but they knew that real change would take time, and it wouldn't happen unless people like them kept pushing for it. "We're in," Sophia said, her voice firm. "If you want our help with this, we're happy to work with you to make sure the changes are meaningful." Emily smiled, her expression sincere. "I'd be honored to have you both involved." The next morning, the sun was still low in the sky as Emily Roberts prepared for the confrontation with Jake Thompson. She sat in her office, papers spread out on her desk, but her mind was far from the reports in front of her. She could hear the murmur of employees moving through the halls outside, their footsteps quickening as the store prepared for the daily rush. But today, the focus was not on sales or customer service. It was on the integrity of the store, the values it upheld, and the actions of one man. Jake Thompson was the new security guard, young, eager, and seemingly unaware of how his actions could reverberate. Emily had read the complaint from Sophia and David Johnson several times. What bothered her most was not just that Jake had racially profiled the couple, but that he had acted with such certainty. There had been no apology, no attempt to understand. He had assumed their presence was an anomaly, that they did not belong in the high-end department store. Emily knew she had to act swiftly. It wasn't enough to simply apologize and move on. If the store was to stand by its values of inclusivity and respect, she would need to make an example out of Jake. His behavior, while individual, was part of a larger problem, and she needed to send a clear message to both staff and customers that the store would not tolerate discrimination. Later that afternoon, Emily sat across from Jake in her office. He was visibly nervous, shifting uncomfortably in the chair, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Emily had already gathered the evidence. The complaint from Sophia and David, CCTV footage showing Jake approaching them in a confrontational manner, and witness statements from customers who had seen the interaction unfold. She had also noted Jake's dismissive attitude when she had reached out to him, for a preliminary statement. There was no defense, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a cold justification of his actions. "Jake," Emily began, her voice steady but firm. "I've reviewed the situation involving Sophia and David Johnson. I want to give you the opportunity to explain your side of the story." Jake swallowed hard, his voice shaky. I didn't mean to offend anyone. I just thought they looked out of place. I've seen people like them in the store before, but they didn't usually belong in the high-end sections. I didn't want any trouble. I thought they might be shoplifters." Emily didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed. She could feel her patience wearing thin. "Jake, there's nothing in our store policies that allows you to assume anyone doesn't belong based on their appearance. You judge them based on their race, not their behavior. And when you approached them, you did so in a manner that was not only disrespectful, but also discriminatory. You humiliated them in front of other customers." Jake's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. "I wasn't trying to be racist. I thought I was just doing my job." Emily took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice calm. "You may not have intended to be racist, Jake, but your actions were. And they had consequences. I've already spoken to Sophia and David, and they are understandably upset. The damage has been done, and we need to correct this, not only for them, but for the future of this store. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to go unaddressed." There was a long pause as Jake seemed to process Emily's words. He opened his mouth to speak again, but hesitated. I didn't mean to mess things up," he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm afraid this is not something that can just be overlooked, Jake. Discrimination, whether intentional or not, is not something we can condone. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to let you go. Effective immediately." Jake's eyes widened in shock. "You're firing me?" His voice cracked with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "For making one mistake?" "This wasn't just a mistake, Jake. It was a violation of our core values, and it cannot be excused," Emily said firmly. "You are welcome to seek other employment, but I cannot keep you here, not with this behavior." For a moment, Jake remained silent, staring at her as if waiting for her to change her mind. When she didn't, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Without a word, he turned and walked out of her office. Emily exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. It hadn't been an easy decision, but it had been necessary. She knew the road ahead would be long. Jake was only one person, but the culture that had allowed such behavior to fester was much larger. There was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed, one that couldn't be solved with a single firing. But it was a start. That evening, Emily sat down with her leadership team. They had gathered in a conference room, the tension palpable as they prepared to discuss the fallout from the incident. She had already briefed them on Jake's dismissal, but now they needed to focus on the next steps. "Jake's firing is just the first step," Emily began, her voice strong and resolute. "We cannot afford to let this kind of behavior slide. We need to take a long, hard look at how we hire, how we train, and how we treat every customer who walks through our doors." One of the senior managers, Rachel, spoke up. "Emily, we're all in agreement, but this isn't going to be easy. Some of our staff will be resistant to change, especially those who don't see the problem. How do we address that?" Emily nodded thoughtfully. "We'll start by implementing comprehensive bias training. Every employee, from the security team to the sales floor staff, will be required to attend. This isn't optional. We'll also create an anonymous feedback system where customers can report any incidents of discrimination or mistreatment. And we'll be reviewing our hiring practices to ensure we're bringing in employees who are committed to the values we stand for." There was a murmur of agreement around the table. "But we need to go further than just training," Emily continued. "We need to make sure that our culture reflects the change we're promising. That means holding everyone accountable, starting with me." As the meeting came to a close, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had a long road ahead, but she was determined to see this through. The store had made a promise to its customers, and it was time to fulfill that promise. But she knew that it would take more than just policy changes. It would take a shift in mindset, a cultural overhaul. And that, she knew, would require the support and involvement of people like Sophia and David. She picked up her phone and called Sophia, eager to discuss how they could be involved in the changes. As the phone rang, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, together, they could create something lasting. The days following Jake Thompson's dismissal were some of the busiest in Emily Roberts' career. As the store's regional director, she had been entrusted with a mandate to steer the company towards a future of inclusivity and accountability. She could no longer rely on just Band-Aid fixes for deeper cultural issues that had been ignored for far too long. There had been an immediate shift in the energy around the store. Staff members, though uneasy about the recent firing, were beginning to sense that things were about to change. Some of them, who had initially believed Jake's actions were isolated, began questioning their own behavior and attitudes. That morning, Emily convened her leadership team in a conference room, determined to lay out a comprehensive plan that would not only address the incident with Jake, but would also begin the process of institutional reform. The meeting was crucial. Sophia and David Johnson had agreed to participate in the development of the new initiatives, and Emily was hopeful that their involvement would help shape an authentic and lasting change. As the team gathered, Emily could feel the weight of the moment. They were at a crossroads, and the decisions made in the next few days would set the tone for the future of the store. She had to tread carefully. Too much change too fast could alienate loyal employees, while not enough could reinforce the status quo. It was a delicate balance. "Let's get started," Emily said as the last member of the team entered the room, taking their seats around the long oak table. "We have a lot to cover today, and I want us to walk out of here with clear action steps. We've already begun the process with Jake's firing, but now we need to look at long-term solutions." She glanced around at the team members. Most were experienced leaders in their own right, but there was a nervous energy in the air. The room was tense as they all wondered what direction Emily would take. "First, I want us to acknowledge that the incident with Jake was not an isolated occurrence," Emily continued, her voice unwavering. "We are dealing with a systemic issue, one that goes beyond just one person's mistake. For far too long, the culture in this store has allowed biases to shape how we treat our customers and how we hire our employees. We can no longer afford to ignore this." There was a murmur of agreement around the table. Emily could see the nods, the collective acknowledgement that this wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about something bigger, a mindset that had permeated their daily operations. "We need to start with our training," she said, tapping her pen against her notebook. "Bias training will no longer be a one-time seminar. It will be an ongoing process that includes practical, real-world scenarios, workshops, and even guest speakers who specialize in diversity and inclusion. This is not optional. Every single employee, from the newest part-timer to the senior leadership team, will be required to participate." Rachel, one of the senior managers, raised her hand cautiously. "I agree with you, Emily, but how do we make sure this isn't just another checkbox we tick off? We need to ensure that the training is effective and that it sticks. People can attend all the seminars they want, but if they don't internalize the lessons, we're not really changing anything." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Rachel. The training needs to be integrated into our daily work. It has to become part of our company culture. And that's where the feedback system comes in. We're going to establish an anonymous channel where employees and customers can report concerns, incidents, or instances where they feel the store's values weren't upheld." The room was silent for a moment as the team processed the idea. This would be a bold move. It would take a lot of trust from employees, but it was necessary if they wanted to build a culture where accountability was front and center. Emily shifted gears. "Next, I want us to look at our hiring practices. I've already asked our HR department to review every application process, every job listing, and every interview we conduct. We need to ensure that our hiring is truly equitable. It's not enough to simply say we're an equal opportunity employer. We need to actively seek out diverse candidates and create an environment where they feel valued and respected." There was a collective nod, but Emily could see the skepticism in some of their faces. Changing the hiring process would not be easy, and there were likely going to be challenges ahead. But she was determined to make sure the store's workforce was as diverse as the community it served. Later that afternoon, Emily received a call from Sophia Johnson. The conversation was brief, but important. Sophia and David had been discussing how they could contribute to the store's cultural transformation. They had been deeply affected by their experience, but instead of letting it fester in anger, they had chosen to channel their frustration into something positive. "Emily, we're happy to be a part of the process," Sophia said on the phone, her voice calm but firm. "We're ready to help however we can, whether it's with the training, the feedback system, or any other initiative you have in mind. This is bigger than just us. It's about making sure this never happens again." "I appreciate you both so much," Emily replied, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I'll keep you updated on our progress. And once we're ready, I'd love for you both to participate in the panel discussion we're planning with the staff. Your voices will be vital in shaping this change." As the day wore on, Emily's mind was focused on one thing: making sure the changes she was proposing were not just theoretical. She wanted to see action, tangible improvements. The last thing she wanted was to be remembered as the director who promised change, but never followed through. That evening, Emily put in a call to her senior leadership team again. "I need us to have the first bias training session scheduled within the next 2 weeks. I'm serious about this. Let's also start preparing materials for the employee feedback system. We need to create a space where people feel safe sharing their experiences, but we also need to make sure there's accountability behind it." The response was swift, with everyone agreeing to prioritize the new initiatives. Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose as the plans began to take shape. It was only the beginning, but there was a shift happening, a slow but steady change in the store's culture. Sophia and David's involvement in the process would be key. Emily knew that for the store to truly change, the voices of those who had been hurt needed to be heard and valued. The changes would take time, and there would likely be setbacks along the way, but Emily was committed. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but with the support of her team and the Johnsons, she was confident that they could create a better, more inclusive store, one that truly reflected the values they held dear. The store's atmosphere was different now. The walls, once filled with the polished image of luxury, seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of anticipation. Employees were more aware, cautious even, about their behavior. They knew that things had changed, and that they couldn't go back. Emily Roberts had set the wheels in motion for a more inclusive, transparent environment, but the real test would come with the next big step: the panel discussion. It would be the first of many such events, and it was designed not just to acknowledge the recent events, but to create a space where real conversations could unfold. Sophia and David Johnson were integral to the panel's success. Emily had reached out to them after finalizing the plans for the store's first session, knowing their participation would be key to creating an honest dialogue. For Sophia and David, agreeing to speak wasn't just about addressing a personal grievance. It was about being part of something larger, about standing up for a vision of fairness and equity. They weren't there to simply vent. They were there to help others understand the impact of discrimination, to show the human side of what they had gone through, and to be part of the solution. The day of the panel, Sophia and David arrived at the store early, a little anxious but resolute. They had discussed at length what they wanted to say. They both knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. It would require vulnerability. Sophia adjusted her coat as she entered the store, her heart beating faster as she saw the employees gathering in the break room. David, ever the calm presence beside her, squeezed her hand. "We're here for the right reasons," he said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. When they were escorted to the front of the room, they saw the employees sitting in a half circle, their faces a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. At the front was Emily, standing next to a small podium. She smiled warmly as they entered and gestured for them to sit. "Thank you both for being here," she said, acknowledging their presence with a level of respect that had been sorely missing before. Sophia stood up first. She could feel the weight of the moment, but also the power in her voice. She turned to the group, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I want to start by saying that we never thought something like this would happen to us," she began, her voice calm but firm. "David and I were just two people trying to enjoy a day together, to shop at a store we thought we could trust. What happened that day wasn't just about a security guard treating us unfairly. It was about the larger culture of suspicion and assumption that people like us often face." She paused, letting the words sink in. The room was silent, the employees listening intently. Sophia could see a few heads nodding, as if they had begun to understand what she meant. "I'm not here to make anyone feel guilty," she continued, "but I'm here to help people see what we go through every day. It's not just one bad incident. It's a pattern where we're treated differently because of the color of our skin, and it's something that needs to change not just here but everywhere." David stood up next, his expression serious. "Sophia and I could have left that store, embarrassed and humiliated. But we decided to take action, not just for ourselves, but for the countless others who've been treated unfairly in this way. This isn't just about us. This is about creating a space where everyone feels valued, no matter where they come from." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the employees. "We know that no one wants to be a part of a culture that discriminates. No one wants to be the person who perpetuates these biases. But sometimes we need to hear the stories that make us uncomfortable, because only then can we begin to change." The room was quieter now, as employees exchanged glances. Emily could see a shift in the energy, recognition that the conversation was no longer just theoretical. It was personal, and it was real. After Sophia and David shared their experience, the floor was open to the employees. Emily had purposefully structured the session to ensure that everyone, from the cashier to the managers, had the opportunity to speak and reflect. At first, there were hesitations. Some employees were unwilling to share, not sure if they were prepared to confront their own biases. But as the discussion unfolded, something remarkable happened. Rachel, the senior manager who had raised concerns in the earlier meeting, stood up next. "I've been thinking a lot about what we've talked about in the past few days," she said, her voice tentative at first. "And I've realized that I've been complicit in letting things slide. I've seen the way customers of color are treated differently by some of our staff, and I haven't said anything. I've allowed the culture to remain as it is, even though I knew it wasn't right." There was a shift in the room. Rachel's confession broke the tension and opened the floodgates for others to speak up. One by one, employees shared their experiences, moments where they had witnessed or even perpetuated subtle biases. Some were defensive at first, trying to justify their behavior. But as the conversation went on, there was an overwhelming sense of regret. "It's not easy to admit that we've been part of the problem," one employee said. "But hearing Sophia and David's story makes me realize that I need to do better. We all need to do better." By the end of the session, the mood in the room had shifted dramatically. There was a sense of shared responsibility among the staff. Employees weren't just listening to the Johnson story. They were internalizing it. It was no longer just about what had happened to Sophia and David. It was about all the other customers, all the other employees who had felt marginalized or dismissed. That evening, Emily met with Sophia and David to discuss the panel's outcomes. They were both moved by the response, but they knew the real work had just begun. The dialogue had been important, but it was only the first step in a much longer journey. "This is just the beginning," Emily said, her voice resolute. "We've opened the door for these conversations, but now we need to turn them into actions. We need to make sure that the training, the hiring practices, and the feedback system all come together to create a culture where bias is actively challenged, not just talked about." Sophia and David nodded. "We're in this for the long haul," David said, "and we'll be here to make sure it sticks." As Emily, Sophia, and David looked ahead, they knew the journey to real change would be long and difficult. But they had started something important, something that would ripple through the store and, if they were lucky, ripple outward to other organizations and communities. They had made their voices heard, and now they were ready to keep fighting for a world where everyone was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. The store had changed, but the journey was far from over. The walls, once decorated with the glitzy images of luxury brands, now bore new posters, messages of inclusion, respect, and growth. Emily Roberts knew that words alone would never suffice. The work of rebuilding trust with the community would take time and continued effort. The process of real change had begun, but it was clear that accountability would remain the foundation of everything they did going forward. It had been a few months since the panel discussion, and the impact of that first, difficult conversation was starting to become evident in small but meaningful ways. Employees were approaching their customers with a new sense of awareness. The training programs that had been introduced were beginning to take hold. It wasn't perfect, but the shift in culture was palpable. The store had a new mission, a mission grounded in inclusivity and respect. The results of the bias training were becoming apparent in more subtle ways. Employees who had once been standoffish with people of color were now approaching them with warmth and understanding. Cashiers greeted customers with genuine smiles, not just the obligatory pleasantries. The security guards, once wary of every customer who didn't fit the expected mold, began to interact more thoughtfully with the people they were supposed to be protecting. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was a start, a visible sign that the culture of the store was evolving. Still, there were setbacks. Change was never easy, and no transformation could occur without resistance. Emily often found herself in meetings with senior managers who were reluctant to adopt some of the new policies. There were moments of tension, and some employees still clung to outdated ideas about what it meant to be professional or presentable in the retail world. But Emily was resolute. She knew that the changes they had made couldn't be undone. She had seen the difference it made when people, employees and customers alike, felt heard and respected. "We're building a foundation here," she often reminded her team. And foundations take time to set, but once they're in place, they can support something truly great. One day, during a particularly busy afternoon at the store, Emily received an email from Sophia and David. It was brief, but it held a message that made her pause. They had asked if they could meet her the following day. Emily felt a moment of apprehension. She had come to admire them both, and though things had been improving, there was always the fear that their progress might not be enough. When they met the next day, however, it was clear that their message was not one of criticism, but one of appreciation. They had come to thank Emily and the team for the changes that had been made. "We've been watching," Sophia said, her voice full of quiet pride. "We've been in and out of the store a few times since the panel, and we can feel the difference. It's not just the big changes. It's the little things, the way people interact with us now, the smiles, the eye contact. You can't fake that. You've built something real." David nodded in agreement. "We know it hasn't been easy, and we know it's not perfect yet. But there's a noticeable change, and it's because of the work you've done, and the work you're continuing to do." Emily's eyes softened with gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more than you know." As they sat down together, the conversation moved beyond the store. They began discussing broader ideas for creating lasting change within the retail industry, ideas about mentorship, partnerships with community groups, and even potential collaborations on social justice initiatives. The possibilities seemed endless. Sophia, always thoughtful, raised a point that stuck with Emily long after the meeting. "Change doesn't just happen in a vacuum," she said. "You can't do this work alone. You need to engage the community, get people involved, and keep them invested. That's how you ensure real change." David added, "And you have to keep talking. Keep listening. Make sure the voices of those who've been marginalized aren't just heard in moments of crisis, but that they're part of the everyday conversation." As the weeks turned into months, the store continued to evolve. Emily worked closely with the leadership team to ensure that the training programs were reinforced and that employees continued to feel supported as they navigated the new expectations. She implemented regular check-ins, creating a space for employees to voice their concerns or share their experiences. There were still moments of tension, but each time, the store proved that it was stronger than before. The community's feedback played a significant role in reinforcing the store's new direction. Customers began to notice the change. More and more, they remarked on how different the atmosphere was. It wasn't just the absence of discrimination, it was the presence of respect. People felt comfortable, valued, and seen. The store even began receiving recognition for its efforts. Awards for diversity and inclusivity followed, and soon other businesses in the area took notice. Emily was invited to speak at conferences about the transformation that had taken place in the store, and her story of turning a difficult situation into an opportunity for change became an inspiration to others in the retail industry. One evening, as Emily sat alone in her office reviewing some reports, she received a call from Sophia. "Hey Emily, we just wanted to check in and see how things are going. Sophia's voice sounded cheerful but serious. "How's the store doing?" Emily smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's been a journey," she said, pausing to collect her thoughts. "But I'm proud of where we are. We've made progress, and we're continuing to grow. It's not perfect, but we're building something real, something that's going to last." Sophia's voice was warm. "We're proud of you too, Emily. It's been an honor to be a part of it." David's voice came through the phone next. "You've done something amazing, Emily. And we're looking forward to seeing the future of this store and the future of the retail industry as a whole, shaped by the work you've started." Emily sat back in her chair, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The work was far from done, but it had begun, and that was enough. She knew that as long as they kept moving forward, as long as they stayed committed to change, the store would continue to thrive. As she looked out her office window, Emily reflected on the long road that had led her here. She had started as just a regional director in a luxury department store, focused on numbers and profits. But now, she had become a part of something greater, a movement that extended far beyond retail. It was about creating a culture of respect and inclusivity, where everyone, regardless of their background or identity, could walk through the doors and feel that they belonged. The journey had been difficult, full of challenges and resistance, but in the end, it had been worth it. Because when people were given the chance to change, to grow, to listen, real transformation was possible. And that was just the beginning.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.